This short video is a comment on the failure of foreign aid and forms part of a short series. Half a century of foreign aid in a post-colonial world seems to have produced very mixed results. The political considerations during the rivalry between the US and the West and Russia during the Cold War conditioned much of the allocation of foreign aid and budgets. With the end of this Cold War, at least for a period, attention turned to the effectiveness of foreign aid. In the West, the Washington Consensus dominated, with its emphasis on the primacy of markets, integration into the global economy, and the role of the private sector. At the same time, there was recognition of the need for institutional strengthening, creating the framework for markets to work effectively. But still, failed states continued to emerge, some continuing to threaten international stability for decades. Of greater general interest has been the failure of so many developing countries to achieve takeoff into self-sustaining growth, despite the substantial external resources which have been provided over the decades. The lack of sustainability appears regularly in the evaluation of aid and as a major weakness in project finance, to which the response has been to turn to the emphasis upon general budget support. But such support requires robust and transparent recipient aid administration, something often found to be lacking. And so attention is focused upon institutional strengthening, a variation on human capital. However, the problem of aid fungibility remains, with the substitution of budget support for domestic finance, whilst more fundamentally it requires sustained political support with a functioning, transparent and responsive political system. Faced with weaknesses in recipient governments, one response has been to emphasise the potential of non-state actors, such as local government or non-governmental organisations, such as NGOs. However, issues of good governance and efficiency often remain when attempting to employ local non-state actors to deliver aid programmes, whilst the use of donor and international NGOs has not been without criticism. The preference of aid agencies to employ such organisations, together with consultants, is partly driven by the cost efficiencies that they offer to such donor administrations, with whom they can develop a close bureaucratic relationship. But the creation of an aid industry with its own agendas and competing for market share is itself proving problematic. Returning to the broader issue of sustainable development, the crucial factors identified as necessary to achieve such takeoff have varied between developing economies over the decades, but initially the emphasis was upon the absence of capital. This was seen as constraining the shift of economic activity from primary to secondary activities in a world of deteriorating terms of international trade for such primary producers. The failure of the input-output view of the development problem led to a shift of focus to human capital, the need for the complementary human skills necessary to raise productivity. Finally, attention has turned to the need to create the macro environment complementary to microeconomic reform and increased private investment, with its emphasis upon price stability and the constrained growth of government debt. But an alternative, less neoclassical view of the development problem has always been present in the literature. Developing countries in the post-colonial world were still seen as being exploited by the Western economies, especially the USA. In this centre-periphery model, established industrialised countries exploited their comparative advantage to maintain their monopoly in the manufacture of goods, frustrating the emergence of potential competitors who could otherwise exploit their own advantages of cheaper labour. The peripheral countries remain suppliers of raw materials whose relative value, the terms of trade, declined over time in the face of technological advance. But this general view of international economic and political relations fails to explain the contrasting trajectories of post-war developing countries. The economic success of OPEC in raising oil prices has, at least, provided relief from the capital constraint on the development of some countries with this resource. However, the jury remains out on whether some developing countries will productively employ the available resources and complete the transition to a long-term sustainable economy. As for some oil-rich countries such as Nigeria, the failure to exploit their economic opportunity is all too apparent, and alternative explanations have been sought. The resource curse of dependence upon a particular commodity, inflating the exchange rate and thereby undermining more diverse domestic activity, has been one such explanation. One exception to the story of economic failure or stagnation is, of course, China. Its takeoff with a capitalist market model within the context of a one-party dictatorship, that is, state capitalism, has attracted much attention as an alternative to the Washington Consensus. But its specific historic context would make any generalization to other developing countries questionable, although its state capitalism shares some characteristics with the approach to economic development of other East Asian economies such as South Korea, Taiwan and Japan. In China, with its long cultural legacy and entrepreneurial tradition, with its emphasis upon education and the work ethic, it is hardly surprising that it took off when the dead hand of Maoism was lifted. But it is perhaps too soon to evaluate the sustainability of the rise of China, whether its strident nationalism will lead to international disaster, whether the centrifugal forces of this diverse nation will still come into play, or whether the conflicting political, economic and political ambitions amongst the governing elite will undermine the country's progress. The question of the determinants of economic growth remains unanswered, as was apparent in a World Bank study by Michael Spencer. In it, Douglas North, despite being an economist, had focused upon a country's history and institutions as the driving force. Another three economists claimed to have established a statistical relationship between the mortality rate of early settlers and subsequent economic growth. Their argument was that these colonies where mortality rates were low attracted a large number of European settlers who brought with them their institutional and political culture. By contrast, where disease deterred substantial settlement, these institutions and culture never took root. However, although the statistical analysis failed to stand up to further analysis, the focus upon cultural and institutional factors seems well founded. It is proved similarly difficult to identify the significance of corruption in inhibiting a country's economic performance. It has usually been defined as the abuse of public office for private gain. However, it can be argued that the role of the public sector is more significant, since it is here that the opportunities for corruption are most extensive, and the public administration creates the opportunities for corruption in the private sector by creating the necessary institutional and market conditions. Cartier-Bresson has suggested 5 economic conditions which appear to encourage the flourishing of corruption within a society. Firstly, the existence of an exploitable natural resource, for example oil, which provides the opportunity for the state to allocate this scarce public asset relative to demand. It may be accompanied by policies of fixed official prices, which creates opportunities for informal rationing through bribery. Thirdly, low wages in the public sector associated with extensive low-level corrupt payments. Fourthly, high levels of state intervention and planning, for example, protectionism, state-owned enterprises, price controls, exchange controls, import licenses. All of these are characteristic of many developing countries. Finally, economies in transition are likely to have particular problems as they undertake privatisation and establish the relevant legal framework of company and contract law. Analytically, corruption can be expected to impose a variety of economic costs. Broadly, corruption would divert resources from productive activity to protecting property rights. Government, as law creators and enforcers, have a crucial role, as well as being able to engage in resource diversion themselves, that is, rent seeking. Bureaucratic inefficiency can also impose a cost upon an economy, reducing investment and growth. Indeed, any distortion of prices arising from corruption is seen as reducing market efficiency and imposing social costs. State-originated price distortions can take a variety of forms, including wage regulation, unprofitable state-owned enterprises, state agriculture, marketing boards, food subsidies, import controls, exchange controls, and unsustainable exchange rates. From the perspective of the public sector, costs can be both financial and economic. Corruption resulting in tax evasion will clearly reduce the government's tax revenues, but corruption may also add to the government's costs through the allocation of contracts to higher-priced contractors. Such increases in prices will be essential to meet the costs of the bribes that are paid. But the economic cost may be even more substantial, as projects may be undertaken merely to generate bribes, rather than as a reflection of economic development priorities. Such major capital investment projects, sometimes supported through foreign aid, which are never economically viable, may remain a drain on the scarce resources of developing countries for many years. From the broadest perspective, corruption therefore distorts prices through the economy as the costs of bribes are passed on to the final consumer, and it creates delays in economic transactions and additional uncertainty, which may be a crucial element in undermining investment and encouraging capital flight. Lambsdorff comprehensively reviewed attempts to statistically isolate both the causes and consequences of corruption, but this proved problematic. Difficulties arise both in ensuring the degree of corruption and in establishing any causal relationship. For example, does an association between low public sector salaries and the level of corruption reflect the undermining of the tax base to fund public expenditure, that is, corruption causing low pay? Or does it reflect the need for corrupt pay supplements to provide adequate salaries for public sector employees, that is, low pay causing corruption? Attempts were made to establish the significance of the size of the public sector, the level of taxation and degree of regulation, the adoption of interventionist industrial policies, the size of the informal sector, the level of public sector pay, and the dominance of oil or mineral resources in exports. Attempts to examine the institutional context have focused upon the correlation between corruption and the degree of press freedom, extent of democratic institutions, degree of political decentralisation, that is federalism, or the quality of the judiciary, while one study considered the significance of cultural factors such as the dominance of a hierarchical religion. Although attempts at the econometric evaluation of the origins and consequences of corruption present considerable methodological problems, some tentative conclusions can be drawn. There is confirmation that corruption is encouraged in economies with the substantial export earnings from a natural resource, or where the state is interventionist, as suggested by Cartier-Bresson. Corruption is also strongly associated with inefficient public administration and an ineffective judicial system. But these institutions and policies are themselves a reflection of the underlying political and social conditions. I therefore wish to turn my attention to the wider issue of the transition to a relatively stable society and political system that constrains corruption and facilitates sustained economic growth. One possible approach to understanding the interaction of economic and political factors is to turn to Marxian analysis. Marx focused upon the transition from feudalism to capitalism and then to the rise of communism as capitalism experienced the crisis of the falling rate of profit. However, the transition from feudalism to capitalism receives relatively little attention. This is unfortunate, as many failing states seem to share the characteristics of pre-industrial feudal societies. This includes the competition between elites and the emergence of a dominant leader who can lay claim to the state's resources. However, the leader remains threatened by competing noble families in Shakespearean terms, often destabilising the state. In a modern sense, we may define these elites as focused upon membership groups, which may be composed along religious, racial, tribal, class or geographical lines, or city-based versus urban, for example. They may also represent economic interests, for example, the military-industrial complex. The achievement and maintenance of political power is essential to gain control of the state's resources, that is rent-seeking, with which to ensure the continued support of the membership group through either the sharing of these resources, that is clientelism, or through coercion, the security state. The sharing of state resources amongst any leadership elite is usually an essential requirement for political survival. Historically, we can think of tax farming as a particular explicit manifestation of this requirement. In a modern setting, we see it in terms of a wide variety of approaches, from the granting of control of local monopolies, state or private, commission on contracts, sale of state assets, or access to foreign exchange. The advantage of these corrupt practices to any leader is that he may use exposure of these activities by any rival to undermine their legitimacy, a recent strategy pursued by the Chinese leadership. Although it is relatively easy to recognise the characteristic of corrupt practices and to identify the institutional failures that allow them to thrive, discovering the underlying cultural, political and political forces that overcome these constraints and generate societies that can achieve self-sustaining growth is far more problematic. Institutional reform without political and social change will prove futile, as will the emphasis upon foreign aid or private investment as a panacea for economic failure. The principal need of development studies is to provide an analysis of these underlying conditions necessary for achieving economic progress, and to outline the means by which societies may accomplish the transition. The full text of this presentation is available at the website listed at the end of the video.